Our story begins in the year 1986 with the Nintendo Entertainment System, more commonly known as the NES, which was originally released in 1983. The NES had been out for about 3 years at this point, but up until 1985, Nintendo hadn't released any major titles for their system. The only game released during the first year was Pinball on February 2nd, 1984. But then you hit 1985 and bang! You get Super Mario Bros. And Lost Levels in 1986. You get Metroid, Donkey Kong, The Legend of Zelda. They ported the first Mario Bros. Game for the Nintendo arcades over to the NES and then released Super Mario Bros. 2 and 3 in 1988. Then you hit with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Tetris, Contra, Pac-Man and Final Fantasy. So yeah, obviously Nintendo is packing heat with its gallery. But beneath all of these jewel and gemstones, there is one game that I did not mention. Our topic of interest today is none other than Castlevania for the NES, which was released in 1986. In the old days, the primary focus of video games was more on the gameplay rather than on the story because of the shift from arcades to home video game consoles. Arcade games have never been easy, so with the NES, consumers basically had more time to die and repeat the first level of Zelda without wasting their monthly allowance. This was a time when the devs didn't really have much of a proper narrative to support the gameplay like many modern day games do, and only gave a rough idea about what the primary objective was. Mario, save the princess. Tetris, try not to hallucinate. Metroid, destroy Mother Brain. No, not that one. Yeah, that one. And with Castlevania, it was simply defeating Dracula. The first Castlevania game was developed and published by Konami and gained generally positive reviews with critics praising it for its solid gameplay design and huge levels. So, with the commercial success of the first game, Konami decided to turn Castlevania into a franchise and then release Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest in 1987 and Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse in 1989. If we look up where Castlevania is today, then unfortunately the state of the video games is not very good. In 2010, Konami released the Ultimate Edition of Lords of the Shadow, and ever since then they have been more focused on porting the older Castlevania titles onto new generation consoles. So with this tiny history lesson, plenty of people would come to the conclusion that the Castlevania that their parents used to play is dead. But that's not really the case. In March 2007, Federated Studios bought the rights of Castlevania to produce an animated movie with comic book writer Warren Ellis as the lead writer. With 8 rewrites of pre-production, a completely fresh timeline and backstories, lore from the video game series, and by not marketing the project for kids, this movie was bound to be a success. And then they decided the movie was going to be a trilogy. 4 years passed and there were no updates on the project. In 2012, Adi Shankar was approached to make a live-action version of Warren's script, but turned it down because he didn't think the live-action treatment could do the justice to the video games. 5 more years passed, and I don't really think anyone even remembered about this movie anymore. However, in 2017, Powerhouse Studios made a deal with Netflix and revived the project by bringing back Federated Studios, Warren Ellis, and even got Adi Shankar as co-producer and turned the entire project into a 4-season animated series instead of a movie. The original scripts written by Warren were approved by Konami and Netflix, and on July 7, 2017, the first episode finally premiered. And who would have thought that this show would completely slap the franchise into huge profits? Konami is widely known for killing its best titles, and their monthly charts are probably not very stonks. But by reviving a beloved franchise, not only was Konami able to get a hold of some big bucks, but also managed to gain a small amount of love by gamers around the world. Netflix's Castlevania was set in the medieval era of Europe. The story begins at a city called Wallachia when a woman called Lisa comes to the aid of Dracula Vlad Tepes in search of knowledge of advanced science. Dracula's character in the series is the primary focus of the first season, so let's cut all the bullshit and get straight to the point. In the opening 5 minutes of the series, Dracula's character becomes an interesting one. He is shown to be this dark and menacing figure which the world would fear. But up in the brain, he is very well thought out. He's a sharp and reasonable character, and that reason alone will make the audience like him from the very start. He's not the too bad because we said so kind of antagonist of the show. Adi Shankar stated in an interview that the best villains in general are heroes of their own story, and wanted to portray Dracula as a tragic figure for the overall world. How did they do that? Yeah, just kill her wife at the stake. On paper, this reason sounds really generic and bland, but in execution, I think the reason it worked so well was because of how naturally it conveyed the divisive emotions of humans. Lisa's work in the series was to learn about medical science to develop a medicine to save lives, and in return, give Dracula a chance to reconnect with humans as she was willing to give him one. She leaves a very positive impression of herself, which could easily have the audience like her from the very beginning, and would also leave them equally frustrated when they watch her being executed. The main conflict arises when the archbishops of the church manipulate the majority of the citizens of Wallachia that her practices were of witchcraft and that Lisa was a witch. The knowledge given to Lisa by Dracula has been forgotten over the years, and with the archbishop's ignorance and manipulative agenda, the majority of humans had believed them. When Dracula found out about the execution of her beloved wife, it left him enraged over the humans he had given a chance. His sole reason to not hunt humans was the love he had for Lisa, and now with her being executed by her own race, he had no reason to not kill every single one of them. At the end of the execution, Dracula makes an amazing appearance before the humans who witnessed the execution and gave them the span of 1 year to leave Wallachia. Otherwise, he would kill every last human in the city. With this declaration of war, we are lightly introduced to a second lead of the series, Dracula and Lisa's child, Alucard. Alucard believes that his father must reconsider his declaration and instead find the core problem of this tragedy. Right at the beginning, we are shown 3 different views of the world of Castlevania, and I think this is genius, because now the audience will have a solid foundation to stand on and have more reason to sympathize with Dracula, but also be conflicted because Alucard makes a more logical point which results in a long-term benefit. If you think that I have possibly spoiled any part of this show for you, then I must put you to ease that this is the summary of only the first 16 episodes of the show. The amazing thing about the show is not only the incredibly snappy narrative, but also the art and the music of the series, which builds a very significantly immersive atmosphere. It's also worth pointing out at this point that the show does not give a story to the first 2 games. The reason behind this was that the first game was a standalone project and the second was a direct sequel to it. So, the production team instead opted to give a story to the third game of the series, because it was a prequel to the first game and it made much more sense to flesh out the characters and the lore of the series. In episode 2, we are introduced to Trevor Belmont and Saifa Behades, who are the final 2 protagonists of the show and playable characters of the original game. The game, however, also had Grand Dynasty as another companion, but Warren did not include him in the script because he didn't think the character would fit inside the story he wanted to tell. I don't know how the show would have turned out if he was a part of it, but even without him, the characters had an amazing chemistry. It never gets boring to watch the main characters of the show talk to each other. During the conversations, the characters are very thoroughly able to give small bits of information to flesh out the world. Things like where the Belmont family originates from, what kind of magic is used, how Dracula's army is formed, and who the key supporting characters are, which could become the core focus in the future. In the process, it is also able to develop its characters in meaningful ways and give them a reason to stay relevant in the series and not abandon them. It's also worth mentioning that the show has an amazing sense of humor.
Fortunate indeed, then, that I chose not to kill you and eat you, Belmont.
And that I decided against gutting you, flaying you, and turning you into shoes, Alucard.
Such a merry band we are. I will find us a covered wagon and horses if you two can manage not to kill each other while I'm gone.
Oh, please. We're not children.
He shouldn't die.
Yes, fuck you.
The details of the story not only give context to the characters' origins, but also to different weapons like the whips, daggers, and the magic that I mentioned earlier. The series also doesn't only use the world introduced in Season 1, it branches out to different kind of groups settled in different villages and cities. For example, in Season 3 we are introduced to a group of monks who, unlike the archbishops and the humans, favor Dracula's objectives and follow his ideals. You're also hit with different types of vampire families who have their own agendas and look to benefit from Dracula's war. I honestly cannot completely express how amazingly the show is built up and how brilliantly every element of the series respects each other. I've spent so much time on the details of the original plot that I barely have any time left to talk about the animation and the music. So, to sum up these two portions, tell me, what do you think Alucard is going to do in this fight? He dashes straight into the fire and turns into a wolf, storms past the enemies and kills the soldier at the far end, stabs the dude behind him by wielding his sword in his mouth, turns back into his original form, and melee attacks the living shit out of the rest of the soldiers. And in the background, an epic orchestral piece brings life and energy to this fight. Netflix's Castlevania is an astounding achievement. It is carried by wonderful characters, beautiful world building, incredible animation, and a gorgeous soundtrack. While Konami may be thinking of killing another one of its beloved franchises, at least for now the future of Castlevania looks somewhat promising, with the company investing enough money and bringing back the old classics for newer generations. And if you have never experienced anything related to Castlevania before, then I highly recommend you this show, because it is nothing less than a masterpiece.